The dim laboratory lights flickered as the tape recorder spun. What Dr. Thomas Blackwood captured that winter night in 1967 would change everything. Between the static and white noise, something spoke. 3 days later, he vanished without a trace. The government sealed his research for 30 years, until now. Attention! The case you're about to hear was concealed for decades. Before we begin, write in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is at this exact moment, because this story began at exactly the same hour. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology had always been home to brilliant minds, but none quite like Dr. Thomas James Blackwood. His colleagues described him as methodical, precise, and entirely rational, a man of science who spoke little and observed much. In the autumn of 1966, he received a substantial grant from the United States Department of Defense to study atmospheric radio interference. At least, that was the official documentation. What few people knew was that Thomas had been conducting private research for years. He believed that certain frequencies existed beyond our conventional understanding, frequencies that might contain something more than random noise. His notebooks, discovered years later, detailed his theory that the static between radio stations wasn't meaningless interference, but rather fragments of something else, something trying to communicate. The university provided him with an isolated laboratory in the east wing of the physics building, a space that would remain untouched for decades after his disappearance. According to maintenance records, Thomas requested specific modifications to the room. Copper mesh in the walls, special grounding equipment, and most peculiarly, mirrors positioned at precise angles throughout the space. His research assistant, Michael Chen, would later tell investigators that Thomas began sleeping in the laboratory by December. The cot in the corner became his permanent residence. Colleagues who passed by noted the same light burning through the night, always on, never dimming. But what changed everything was the winter storm. On the night of January 17th, 1967, Massachusetts experienced one of the worst blizzards in recorded history. Power lines collapsed under the weight of ice. Communications across the state failed, and as the electrical grid fluctuated, Thomas Blackwood made his first recording. The tape recovered from his laboratory contains 83 minutes of what appears to be ordinary static. But at precisely the 47-minute mark, something changes. The static pattern shifts, and beneath the noise, almost imperceptible, a voice. Analysis performed by audio specialists from 3 separate government agencies confirmed the same conclusion. The voice was speaking words, but they couldn't agree on what those words were. Some heard numbers, others heard names, and some refused to document what they believed they heard. The morning after the storm, Michael arrived to find Thomas sitting motionless before his equipment. According to his statement, Thomas looked different. His normally meticulous appearance was disheveled, but it was his eyes that Michael remembered most vividly. They seemed to be looking at something no one else could see. Thomas spoke only once that morning. He told Michael, "I need to make adjustments. The frequency isn't right." But I heard it, speaking through the spaces between sounds. For the next 2 days, Thomas worked without stopping. He modified his equipment, adjusting components and recalibrating his receivers. Michael noted that Thomas began covering all reflective surfaces in the laboratory, except for the strategically placed mirrors. When asked why, Thomas merely said, "They're watching through reflections, but only certain angles are safe." The final recording was made on January 20th. The tape begins with Thomas speaking clearly into the microphone. His voice, previously confident and measured, now carried an unmistakable tremor. "This will be my final documentation of Project Frequency 13. I have refined the receiver to isolate the transmission source. If my calculations are correct, what follows will be clarity. The next 40 minutes contain nothing but the familiar static. Then, at the 42-minute mark, the recording changes. The static doesn't simply shift this time, it stops completely. For 11 seconds, there is perfect silence. And then, what happens next has been the subject of intense debate among the few who have heard the complete recording. Official reports describe it as audio anomalies consistent with equipment failure, but those who worked closely with the investigation have described it differently. Some say it sounds like thousands of voices speaking simultaneously. Others describe it as a single voice speaking words that somehow contain multiple meanings layered upon each other. The recording ends abruptly at the 53-minute mark, and Dr. Thomas James Blackwood was never seen again. University security found his laboratory empty the following morning. His equipment was still running, the tape still spinning, but Thomas was gone. No signs of struggle were present. Nothing appeared disturbed or out of place. He had simply vanished. The investigation that followed revealed several troubling details. The security cameras covering the hallway outside his laboratory had malfunctioned precisely at 11:43 the previous night, the same time the recording ended. No one had seen Thomas leave the building. His car remained in the parking lot. His apartment was untouched, beds still made from days before. But there was something else. Something the official reports mentioned only briefly before the case was classified. Every mirror in the laboratory had been shattered, not broken or fallen, but shattered from within, as though something had tried to emerge from the other side. The government seized all of Thomas's research within 24 hours. His equipment was removed, his notes confiscated. Michael Chen was interviewed extensively before being reassigned to a classified project in New Mexico, and the laboratory was sealed. For months, the university maintained that Thomas had taken a leave of absence. By the following year, his position had been filled by another professor. His disappearance became a whispered story among physics students, a cautionary tale about obsession and burnout, but 3 people continued searching for answers. His sister, Elizabeth Blackwood, his former colleague, Dr. Patricia Morrison, and a journalist named Robert Hayes, who had been investigating unusual radio phenomena when he stumbled upon Thomas's story. What they discovered in the years that followed painted a disturbing picture. Thomas hadn't been the first scientist to experiment with these frequencies. Between 1952 and 1965, 7 other researchers across 4 countries had conducted similar experiments. All had reported hearing voices in the static. All had become increasingly isolated and paranoid, and 5 of them had disappeared without explanation. The pattern was always the same: storms or electrical disturbances, recordings of static, and then absence. Elizabeth gained access to some of her brother's personal journals through a former student who had copied them before the confiscation. The entries from his final weeks revealed a man increasingly certain of his discovery, but also increasingly afraid. On January 12th, he wrote, "The voice responds to questions now, not immediately but eventually. Answers emerge from the noise. I asked about its nature. It replied with a word I cannot transcribe. The closest approximation would be messenger. On January 15th, I asked where it comes from. The response took hours to arrive. When it did, I heard only these words: the space between thoughts. I must consider the possibility that what I'm communicating with isn't external at all, but something within the human mind itself, a frequency that resonates with consciousness." His final journal entry, dated January 19th, contained just one line: "It knows my name now, and I can see its reflection when I close my eyes." The university archives contained maintenance requests from the same period. Thomas had reported unusual phenomena in his laboratory: lights activating without being switched on, equipment operating when unplugged, and most frequently, unexplained reflections in surfaces that should not have been reflective. In 1972, Patricia Morrison attempted to recreate Thomas's experiment using his notes and specifications that Elizabeth had preserved. She constructed a similar receiver and waited for electrical storms. For months, she recorded nothing but ordinary static. Then, during a severe thunderstorm in April, her equipment detected something. The partial recording that survived contains mostly atmospheric interference. But approximately 30 minutes in, a voice becomes audible. It speaks just one sentence. "Thomas Blackwood is with us now." Patricia abandoned her research immediately. She left academia entirely, eventually relocating to a remote area of Maine where she refused all contact with former colleagues. Her final communication was a letter to Elizabeth that contained only 4 words: "Stop looking for him." The journalist Robert Hayes continued investigating throughout the 1970s. He traced connections between Thomas's research and classified government programs involving long-distance communication. His notes suggested he believed Thomas had accidentally intercepted transmissions from a secret government project, a project designed to communicate with something not entirely human. But as he delved deeper, Robert's investigation took a strange turn. He began writing about mirrors and reflective surfaces, about voices that spoke from static, and about being watched through glass. His final article, never published but found among his effects, claimed that Thomas hadn't disappeared at all. He had been pulled through to the other side. Robert Hayes was found dead in his apartment in 1979. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but Elizabeth, who identified his body, later told a close friend that his eyes had been completely white, as though the irises and pupils had been erased. The government maintained its silence. All requests for information regarding Thomas Blackwood were denied. His research remained classified, his disappearance unexplained, until 1997, when portions of his file were declassified under the Freedom of Information Act. Most pages contained heavy redactions, but certain details emerged. The Defense Department had indeed been funding research into unusual frequencies. And Thomas had been part of a program called Project Echo that investigated what they termed non-standard communication vectors. The declassified documents included transcripts of the voice captured in Thomas's recordings, but these transcripts raised more questions than they answered. Each analyst who listened to the recording had heard something completely different. Some transcribed numbers and coordinates. Others heard philosophical statements about the nature of reality. One analyst reportedly heard only his own name, repeated for the duration of the recording. The final page of the declassified file contained a curious note from a senior official whose name was redacted. It read simply, "Blackwood found something, but we cannot be certain it was God. Recommend immediate termination of all related projects." But the story doesn't end there, because in 2003, something unprecedented occurred. A ham radio operator in the same area of Massachusetts where Thomas had conducted his research, reported picking up an unusual transmission during an electrical storm. The transmission contained a voice reciting a sequence of numbers and words. Analysis later revealed the voice pattern matched the limited samples preserved of Thomas Blackwood's voice. The final words of the transmission, repeated 3 times, were, "The frequency is open now. They're coming through." In the years since, similar transmissions have been reported during major electrical storms across North America, always the same voice, always containing references to the others and the space between, always ending with the same warning. Elizabeth Blackwood died in 2011, still searching for answers about her brother's fate. In her personal effects was a sealed envelope containing a recording she had apparently made herself just weeks before her death. The recording is brief. In it, Elizabeth speaks clearly and calmly. "I saw Thomas last night, not in a dream. He was in my mirror, standing behind my reflection. He hasn't aged a day. He told me they've learned to use our technology now, our phones, our computers, our cameras. Anything with a screen can become a doorway. He said they're curious about us. They want to understand us by becoming us. and they're almost ready to cross over completely. The recording ends with a strange static interference, and through that static, very faintly, a man's voice can be heard saying, "Elizabeth, don't let them see your eyes." The original equipment from Thomas Blackwood's laboratory remains stored in a government facility in Maryland. According to former employees, the equipment is kept in a specially constructed room, lined with lead and without any reflective surfaces. The room is monitored constantly, not for someone trying to break in, but for something trying to break out. In 2018, during a severe electrical storm that knocked out power across the eastern seaboard, security cameras in the facility recorded a strange anomaly. For approximately 17 seconds, the equipment that had remained dormant for decades suddenly activated. The meters moved, the dials turned, and the tape recorder began spinning. No recording was produced, or if it was, it remains classified. But the security guard on duty that night later reported hearing a voice through the static of his radio, a voice that knew his name and whispered the names of his children. He resigned the following day. Thomas Blackwood's research notes contain a hypothesis that seems prophetic in retrospect. He suggested that consciousness itself might be a frequency, a signal broadcast from somewhere else and received by the human brain, and that certain conditions, electrical storms, specific equipment configurations, even certain mental states, might allow that signal to be interrupted or modified, or for other signals to break through. To this day, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology maintains that Thomas Blackwood left the university voluntarily to pursue other opportunities. His name does not appear on any memorial or in any official history. The laboratory he once occupied has been renovated and repurposed many times. Currently, it houses communications equipment for the university's radio station. Station employees occasionally report strange phenomena, equipment that operates independently, recordings containing unexplained voices, and most commonly, the sensation of being watched through screens and monitors when working alone at night. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports from listeners who call the station during electrical storms. They describe hearing a man's voice breaking through the broadcast, a voice asking questions about human consciousness and the nature of reality, a voice that sometimes knows details about the listeners that it shouldn't possibly know. The university has replaced the broadcasting equipment multiple times. The phenomena persist. The last known photograph of Thomas Blackwood shows a serious man with intense eyes and a thoughtful expression. Colleagues described him as brilliant but grounded, rational to a fault, not someone given to flights of fancy or spiritual speculation. Yet his final recorded words before his disappearance suggest something profound had changed in his understanding. What we perceive as reality is merely the surface of a deeper transmission. God isn't speaking through the static. God is the static, the space between certainties, and now it knows we're listening. The last document was dated the year 1979. No new record was ever found. Some say none of this ever happened. Others prefer not to comment.